Thank you so much for coming. This is unexpected. An hour ago I was saying, we should have promoted this to the preview audience today, and I'm sure glad we didn't. So, when I was an undergrad at SPU writing film reviews for The Falcon, a long time ago in the galaxy, I wanted to see more film stuff happening on campus. My name is Jeffrey Overstreet, and when I went to SPU, we had a special screening of Top Gun once. That was film life at SPU then. What's happening now with our new film studies major is very exciting. We had a screening of some very experimental film last night, hosted by Dr. Rendelman, with our special guest, Dennis Findley, and that was a trip. But it's also great to talk with students about film and watch films in class every week. That's kind of a dream come true for me. I should also mention that two recent SPU grads, Zeke Earle and Chris Caldwell, just showed their film Prospect at South by Southwest to such rave reviews. Variety said, and I quote, "This is what the standalone Star Wars movies should look like." Woo! That is a blurb you want on your movie. Congratulations to them. I can't wait till it's distributed. I hear it's going to play at the Seattle Film Festival. In the next few weeks, we're going to launch a new SPU film blog called North by Pacific Northwest. I'm excited about that. Speaking of progress, when I was an undergrad, diversity SPU was not anything to shout about. And what I see just in the room today is so encouraging to me. What I see on campus and in my classes is so encouraging to me. And that has a lot to do with our subject today, so it is a privilege to be here participating in this. In my faith and film class right now, we've just begun a tour of the world. In the next few weeks, we are going to visit Germany to see how the Berlin Wall fractured a society. We're going to go to the Republic of Mali in West Africa, to Paris, France, to battle-scarred villages in Rwanda, to a pizza parlor in Brooklyn, to Kabul, Afghanistan, where a girl's father has been imprisoned for trying to teach her to read, to Ireland's Abbey of Kells, and to a rural village at the edge of the Japanese woods, where something called a Totoro might live. As my own interest in international movies has expanded, my patience for the crowd-pleasing sensationalism of blockbusters has weakened a bit. And yes, I confess, I'm usually bored by superhero movies. When it comes to Marvel movies, you can probably hear my scowl in my reviews. They're fun, but they're formulaic. They take violence pretty lightly. They indulge imagery of downtown skyscrapers being destroyed, as if America has already forgotten that the words shock and awe are not about entertainment. But the ongoing popularity of these films has forced me to take them more seriously, and they have been deserving, I think, more and more serious attention in recent years. The heroes have become more complicated, and the villains have become more sympathetic. The plots of recent titles like Captain America: Civil War, and other Avengers movies, Thor: Ragnarok, have wrestled with urgent political questions. Doctor Strange, for example, instead of destroying a downtown, restores one. And its hero, reflecting the Christian conviction of its director and writer, Scott Derrickson, triumphs by spreading his arms to receive the full force of the enemy's hatred, seeming to die and rise again over and over and over again, instead of channeling his powers into a destructive weapon. And today I get to announce that the director of Doctor Strange has just accepted an invitation to visit our faith and film class in a few weeks, to share his experiences at the helm of one of these movies. So if you're in that class, start thinking of your questions now. So this brings me to Black Panther, and I'm overjoyed that we get to learn more today about this particularly amazing film. Based on a comic book first imagined in 1996 by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and in recent years written by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Black Panther, the movie, is directed by Ryan Coogler, who also directed Fruitvale Station and Creed. And it marks a landmark in American box office history because a few weeks ago, Black Panther and A Wrinkle in Time were at the top of the box office. First time the #1 and the #2 top grossing movies were directed by African Americans. That's amazing. There's Ava DuVernay. This is part of an unprecedented parade of popular movies that circle questions about race in all kinds of genres. Girls Trip, Get Out, Hidden Figures, and don't overlook the important, if undercooked, subplots of The Shape of Water and 3 Billboards. Or my favorite, the severely underrated 2016 film set in a Cincinnati community center that we just watched this week in Reading 1100 called The Fits. Streaming now on Amazon Prime. While we might hear an ongoing agenda of white supremacy from some powerful white men, the words of the prophets, as Simon and Garfunkel like to sing, are written on the subway walls or maybe the Cineplex screens. But Black Panther is by far the most essential of these visions, these recent ones. As reported by Carvel Wallace in an extraordinary New York Times article called Why Black Panther is a Defining Moment for Black America, we learn that the trailer, which arrived last June, won 89 million views in 24 hours. January 10th, the ticket pre-sales surpassed those of all previous Marvel movies. And when the movie opened in 2018, the movie opened in 2018, way back in 2017, Black Panther was the most tweeted about film. It might be easy to say that this is because it's the first movie about a black superhero, but that would be false. We've had Blank Man, Blade, Shaft. I hadn't thought, but yeah, as a comic book character. Hancock. It would be interesting to talk about why these films didn't have the success that Black Panther did. Wallace believes that the blackness of those characters, as he puts it, is somewhat incidental. By contrast, he says, Black Panther is steeped very specifically and purposefully in its blackness, and notably, that this is not a movie about black poverty. What I find most exciting about Black Panther is that it reveals histories, cultures, and traditions that I never encountered growing up. I was taught a false narrative, written by historians who were deeply rooted in a toxic combination, I would say, of arrogance and ignorance. Wakanda, in a word, is awesome. It's a kaleidoscopic vision of a society powered by imagination and a little something else, vibranium. Wakandans have bulletproof armor, just for starters. Vibranium powers a magnetic transit system. It even enables Andy Serkis to act without motion capture. Amazing stuff. I'm tired, though, of seeing diversity on the big screen meaning sidekicks. And this movie gets us past that. I mean, Star Trek was countercultural in its time, but we can do better than Kirk, Spock, Bones, Scotty Chekhov, and Uhura. Nevertheless, and I'm going to risk something here, I have some misgivings about this Marvel film too. As with so many adventure movies, including, I dare say, those about Luke Skywalker and Harry Potter, why is the main character not the most interesting character? Far more interesting are the women around him, in my opinion. They upstage him with their personality and their humor and their verve. Okoye, Shuri, and Wakanda's Queen Mother. I'd like to see standalone movies about all of them, especially her. Stephen Gradanis in the National Catholic Register says that some of the beats here too directly echo last year's Thor Ragnarok, which also turned on a contested royal succession, a villain with a secret past, and a grudge in the hidden sins of his royal father, and an anti-colonial backbeat, says Gradanis. Most troubling for me, though, is that this almost ideal society still chooses its ruler by hand-to-hand combat. Come on. There's room for improvement. Why must a film about breaking out of isolationism, engaging the culture and changing the world, all boil down to a showdown to the death? That's a film critic's take, though, and it only scratches the surface. The real wisdom today comes from someone who's been thinking about these questions for many years and who sees in Black Panther an opportunity to enlighten us, and I find him an essential guide on these matters. I clearly have a lot to learn. So it's my pleasure to introduce Associate Professor of Theology Brian Bantum. He is the author of The Death of Race, Building a New Christianity in a Racial World, and Redeeming Mulatto, A Theology of Race and Christian Hybridity. So to tell you about Black Panther in depth, and the new social justice major, Dr. Brian.
I'll put my face in his face. Welcome, everybody. It's so good to see so many people. This is awesome. Yes, my name is Dr. Brian Bantum, and I teach theology here, as well as co-direct the newly launching social justice and cultural studies major, which I'm really, really excited about. And I just want to thank Professor Overstreet for a wonderful introduction. And I think in a lot of ways it's kind of beautiful to have kind of both of these introductions, because in some ways we get we get a little bit of insight into kind of how a film critic even kind of approaches the movie, right? So you have like characters and development and all that kind of wonderful stuff. I come at it, my training is in theology, but also in cultural studies. And really what was interesting to me about the film and thinking about the film was both the immersion of it myself. I mean, I went to Wakanda, I went back to Wakanda like 3 times. It would have been even more if I had enough money that month. But the other part of it, though, is also as a question of what does it mean, what does this movie mean in this moment? What kind of language, we might say, is it speaking? And how is it speaking in this particular moment? And why is that important for us as we begin to think through this? And so I'm just going to give a plug for the social justice cultural studies major now, before I get too far into this, is to say that essentially this is the work of cultural studies, is to say that everything is language. Your body, what you wear, how you do your hair, who you see up front, who you don't see up front, and that this is a relatively new idea. I think a lot of us kind of take it for granted because we live in such a visual culture, right? But this idea that our bodies speak something, and that oftentimes absence doesn't speak or speaks even louder, is a new idea. And so cultural studies is a field that tries to understand how do cultures, people, create meaning. And in what ways does that meaning get grafted onto people's bodies? But then also, how do people in societies who have been marginalized by those stories thereby also create counter narratives about who they are and who they think they ought to be? And how do they create those using sometimes political, economic, social systems, or oftentimes creating their own economic, social systems that sometimes then get co-opted, and then they have to create new ones, right? And so you kind of see this kind of constant fluidity. And it's our belief that if you're going to do social justice, that social justice isn't this like ideal kind of out there that we need to figure out a better way towards, but rather really justice is a way of reading and living in the world that allows all people to discover and live into the flourishing that God intends for them, whatever that means. And so one of the reasons why we talk about social justice and cultural studies is that in order to have justice, you need to be able to read and interpret culture. You have to be able to read and name what are the marginalizations, what are the things that are kind of pushing against us and dehumanizing us, so that we might begin to recognize and articulate our humanity in ever new ways. And the reality is this is a constant, ever-growing process. And so cultural studies isn't about a kind of set of steps, it's about a way of reading and creating in imaginative ways. And so, so if anyone wants to talk about the major with me or with Dr. Bailey or Dr. Siegel, please feel free to see us or drop us an email. So, all right, so did my spiel, social justice, cultural studies major. And let's talk a little bit about Black Panther. Now this idea of interventions, right? Of how is it that we begin to speak ourselves into being. This movie is a beautiful example of that, right? So if we think about the last few movies that won Academy Awards, right? So, or were nominated, 12 Years a Slave, right? Or movies along those kinds of narratives. What do we see? We see the kind of brave slave enduring sometimes excruciating pain and suffering and violence, and somehow they overcome, right? So that's kind of one palette, except for maybe Django, who just blows everything up afterwards, which is awesome, by the way. Whenever I need a kind of cathartic moment, I just watch Django, and I just watch the second half, and I just I'm like, yes! I don't know what that says about me or a moment or whatever. Or you have like the Driving Miss Daisy or The Help, right? The kind of sweet Black women who are kind of abused constantly, and yet they retain their dignity and eventually work to find enlightenment in some young white person, right? And the story ends up being them at the end of the day. And basically these are the two tropes that we have, right? Get Out was kind of starting to deviate from that a little bit. But in a way, it's a different kind of slave movie, right? It's a different kind of movie about how we are enslaved in contemporary moments in many ways. But at the same time, we look at a more recent movie that I want to kind of compare to this, and that is Moonlight. How many people have seen Moonlight? Beautiful, beautiful movie. And in a way, it's almost a kind of, it's the other side of this movie. It's a way in which a young gay Black man comes to navigate and discover who he is, both finding a home through a kind of adoptive figure, but also trying to discover his own personhood and sexuality, and never shies away from kind of tenderness, intimacy, and beauty in small moments, right? Even though he's never quite sure about who he is or where this road takes him. And so in a way, I want to say that actually Black Panther is a kind of popularization of this moment that we're in that's so beautiful, and that is where Black folk get to articulate who they are and their stories and the beauty of their personhood without the burden of having to account for white violence, right? Because the reality is when we live in a world of white hegemony, that is to say where hegemony is a kind of totalizing power that you can't get yourself out from under. In white hegemony, these previous movies I mentioned, your only option is to be a kind of heroic person who just takes it, right? Or you get completely ground down into the violence that you have to endure. And so like, oh, you're so brave. You're like, okay, thanks, that's cool, but I'm just me, right? I grew up here. And so what we see in Black Panther is the possibility of the individuality of Black life, right? So what is Wakanda but actually a place that is kind of free from the impingement and the violence of a colonial world that has determined almost every aspect of what our bodies mean, right? And so what we see in Wakanda is that kind of what are those possibilities? It is both a deep and long history, right? Traditions that are passed down over time that get retained, right? And don't get tainted by others. We see an aesthetic, right? Whether it's in clothing, whether it's in hair, whether it's in jewelry, whether it's in ways of being, in a sense that is their way of being and their life in some ways, which is a continually important, beautiful moment. And I think also what we also see is also the power, right? And so in some ways, what I love actually about this being in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is the kind of sheer power that not just one individual holds, but in a way that his power comes from the community, right? It's bound to. It's actually, it's literally, if you think about vibranium, it's woven into the very fabric of the land. And that's where his power comes from. It's both taken away and given through this kind of plant. And so in a way, what we start to see is not just an image of kind of a singular black excellence or singular black power, but really the power that we communally hold. In the community that is grounded in not just our kind of making something up in a moment, but a kind of long, long history of what it means to kind of live free. And so those are some of the things that I see. And I think one of the most important parts of this, again, I just want to echo Professor Overstreet, is the prominence and the power of the women in the movie. I found T'Challa interesting in his own way. But to me, what was really interesting, and kind of felt it was a little Harry Potter-ish, is like, dude's dead without Okoye, right? There is no way. He's kind of just not super smart, not even really the best fighter, people beating up all the time. But what does he need? He needs the community of people collectively to kind of create this possibility. And then the other thing I love about the film, I'll say I'm ambivalent about the film, actually, is this kind of the relationship between Killmonger and T'Challa, right? And so one of the beautiful things about it is that insofar as it tries to tell the story of black diasporic life and black kind of colonial, post-colonial life, it tries to actually name the difficulties of how do we navigate that, right? What are the choices before us? Do we just blow everything up, right? Or do we assimilate? Do we kind of hold back in some ways? And the kind of common trope I heard was, is this a Malcolm versus Martin kind of thing? Which is actually it's actually the wrong comparison. It's actually Toussaint and Malcolm, right? So if you remember, Toussaint was the one who led the revolution in Haiti, right? And so everyone was like, wow. So when that Haitian revolution, it scared the shit out of white planters in the South. They were like, that's possible? No! In a way, that's Killmonger. He says the only way out of this is if we are on top. The only way that we get on top is by garnering the full power and strength that we have, right? And part of what was so powerful here was you saw it in tweets, like as soon as the first day was, right? I'm a team Killmonger, right? Killmonger is the hero. I'm with Killmonger all day. And I saw this over and over and over again. And if we're going to think about this kind of larger kind of cultural studies field, what's happening here? Well, we live in a moment of visceral violence against black bodies, right? What one author has called the white lash, right, against Obama's presidency. And what we see is not just a kind of a rhetorical return to some sort of thing. We see violence, right? We see ICE folks chasing people down. We see walls wanting to be boarded up. We see people being shot indiscriminately and the president just standing back as though it's nothing. Sheer violence, right? Unadulterated racism in the White House in this moment, right? And so when we see this, we thought maybe, I was even part of this, 10 years ago, I was like, well, we're not in the 60s, we're not in the 40s. Surely we're making some sort of progress. And then we see the election, I'm like, oh, no, there's no progress, right? And now all of a sudden, Killmonger starts to sound pretty good, right? Because I can stand here and give you all of the reasonable, rational reasons for why we ought to be recognized as full human beings in all the ways that we're not. And I will continue to have white folk tell me, well, maybe you should wait, or it's not really valid, or, oh yeah, sure, and then do nothing about it, right? So in a way, Killmonger is maybe a viable option for many people, a visceral option, one that they identify with profoundly. But of course, the critique of this is, well, what is Killmonger's violence is not just a violence against white folk, right? But it is a kind of patriarchal, masculinized, kind of toxic masculinity, right? That destroys all people, right? Women included inside of this space. And so maybe that's not totally the option that we want to go down, because in a way, what does violence do? But it becomes the totality of who we think we are, and that anything attained by violence requires violence in order to maintain it, right? But at the same time, T'Challa represents maybe a kind of Malcolm figure, someone who has actually attained what it was that Malcolm hoped for, a self-sustaining society free of white supremacy, right? And so in a way, T'Challa has to ask the kind of question of what does it mean to enter into the world in a different kind of way. And so I think this is a very important conversation that's always happening inside of diasporic communities, any kind of community that's marginalized. The question is, how do we articulate who we are? How do we live into this? How do we attain the kind of freedoms that we need in order to realize who we ought to be? Do we tear shit down, or do we work inside of the system? And it's always a constant tension, right? So that's one of the things I loved about the movie, was the fact that it was willing to kind of tell that subtleties and even show that that subtlety was not just between two individuals, but within the community, right? That the community was trying to figure out who should we follow and how do we live into this. So in all of those ways, really beautiful. But the thing that I felt hard about it though was in some ways that was the easy move to make. It was the easy move to make. Well, what do I mean by this? Well, notice the really subtle shift of the CIA figure, right? From being the person that wanted to kind of basically invade Wakanda. Has anybody seen the animated series, 6-part series released? I think it was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. BET just reran it. So look up Black Panther. It's part of the Marvel Knights of Marvel series. So interesting. They made some very different decisions in that one. So in that one, you kind of open up and you find out what Wakanda is, and then you switch to the White House. And in the White House we found a large deposit of vibranium underneath this mysterious jungle. They call it Wakanda. How should we get in there? How can we topple the government? They have a person named Donda Lisi or something like this, and so it's basically the Bush White House, and so you see like basically a plot to intervene in the power struggle to take advantage of it and take over Wakanda's resources, right? So that's not what this movie did, right? The CI guy is kind of the bumbling, I don't really know, white guy who's well-meaning, managed to fly an alien ship like almost instantly, and is a really like lovely comedic foil. Yay, CIA, right? And you're like, ah. So in a way, what the movie did was actually take kind of the easy way out by saying, we're actually going to talk about our internal conflict rather than talk about the reality that made this conflict necessary, which is colonialism, white supremacy, and an enduring colonial state that continues to abuse dark peoples of the world. And then, of course, we see this encapsulated in the last kind of post-credit scene, right, with T'Challa at the UN. We want to build bridges, not walls. And right, okay, Disney got a hold of this one. But I think what it does do, though, is that the movie for us, I think, is on the one hand, this idea of Wakanda. So my wife and I'd be like, forever, right? Like all the time, right? It gives you a kind of visual space where you see yourself fully, right? And where everyone can see yourself fully. And if for just 2 hours, it gives you the possibility of kind of enduring and living into that possibility again and again and again. And I hope, hopefully, as the movie kind of continues, these instantiation, the sequels continue, that maybe they might complicate the story of whiteness a little bit. I kind of have my doubts, but we'll see. And that would be a beautiful thing to see as we go forward.